Hey, welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History, where we help believers make sense of the world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that built those times. So we're continuing our podcast series today, Empire, a 250-year American story. We've seen the discovery of the New World so far. We've seen its settlement in the past episodes of this series. And now, today, we're going to start moving ever closer to independence and revolution. Now, if you haven't been to the website yet, theendofhistory.net, I encourage you to check it out. Go check out that website, theendofhistory.net. You'll not only find all the episodes in this podcast series, but also a host of other series and topics that we've developed through the years, plus perspectives and articles on a wide range of topics aimed to develop and strengthen believers' perspectives and the chaotic age we live in. Check it out. Again, that's www.theendofhistory.net. You can also get there by just typing in jbshreve.com.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So today and in the next few episodes, we arrive at one of the points on this journey that I've been most excited about covering so far. We're going to begin looking at the revolutionary period of American history. Now, this period is honestly the impetus that drove the development of this whole series at this particular time, I guess. This year, 2026, when this is being released, is the year that we commemorate the 250th anniversary of American independence and really the American Revolution. And as we jump into this period of the history of the American Empire, honestly, my first thoughts are simply questions. Why did this work at all? And I'm not just talking about America, the nation. Back up even further than that. I'm talking about the original inception, the idea of a new nation, of independence and revolution. Why now, as we come towards 1776 in our story, at this point in the story, why did it work now? What allowed this move toward independence to work, to succeed? I mean, think about it for a minute. Imagine you're living during those times. There's no central communication system. There's no internet. There were lots of newspapers, but the media was really nothing at all like it is today. Information traveled really slow. At one pivotal point of the American Revolution, in fact, when a key alliance with the French was secured, a turning point in that war, it took nearly 3 months for the leaders of the American military, like George Washington, to even learn about this alliance. That's how slow good news traveled. Even worse, bad news or inaccurate news. There was no central authority structure. I mean, there was the English King George III in the British colonial system, but that was the thing being rebelled against, right? The alternative was the Continental Congress. That didn't spring up out of nowhere. But what made it credible, legitimate? If I'm living at that time period, what makes John Adams or John Hancock or William Henry Lee, what makes them legitimate to speak on my behalf? What legitimizes them? What about the contradictions? A lot of the key sparks that set fire to the wheels of revolution in the American colonies had nothing to do with taxes. The Continental Congress and local organizations from Massachusetts to Virginia, they protested the taxes, but when they had to raise taxes in order to empower a military that could fight against the British, how did they do that? How did that possibly work on the ground? Also, we know that these things, these questions got answered and they worked in the 13 American colonies, but they didn't work and they didn't get answered positively in the other British colonies that Americans honestly don't usually consider because they didn't come along with us in the fight. The British had 13 colonies on the American mainland, but there was a whole lot more than that in the New World. In Canada, after the French and Indian War, or what the Europeans called the 7 Years' War, the British had taken over Quebec, previously called New France, as one of its colonies. There was Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, St. John's Island, Rupert's Land. In the Caribbean, the British had highly significant colonial holdings that played a vital role in the British Empire's economic strength. There was also the lands of Florida. There were more than 20 British colonies, in fact, in the New World. Why did only 13 of them succeed and rebel from the British Empire in 1776? And what made all of this work at this point in history? I keep coming back to that question. So these are some of the questions we're going to look at in this episode and the next few episodes. I think it's just too easy to look at these events from history, major events like the American Revolution, and just assume they were a natural outflow of the course of history, like it was a normal, natural thing. The reality is these things took place in spite of the natural flow, the natural outflow of history. This shouldn't have worked. There were far more reasons for American independence and the American Revolution to fail than to succeed. So why did it? Well, to understand why the revolution in America did work, why it worked when and where it did, we have to start with the ideas that fueled it. We give too little space to the role of ideas in the shaping of human history. The more I read about history, the more I read about events, even philosophy, the more I realize ideas are a much bigger propulsion force in the flow of human events than we realize. These invisible concepts are the powers that really drive civilization forward. Yeah, there are wars and technologies that represent these practical gears that turn human history, but behind those, you're always going to find invisible ideas. When researching for this episode, I read a quote from a historian by the name of Pauline Maier. It's in her book, American Scripture. That book looks at the history behind the Declaration of Independence. And she writes, this was just an intriguing thought that I had never considered before. She writes, the milestones of English history are marked not so much by stone monuments as by parchment documents, including an abundance of addresses, petitions, and declarations. Now that struck me. The history of Rome is marked by stone monuments. The same for ancient Egypt, Persia, even medieval Europe and other ancient lands. We look for stone monuments to tell the story of what happened. But with England, you think Magna Carta. You think of other major documents all the way to the Americas. And behind those documents, there are ideas. The document can be lost. The document's not really meaningful. We don't need the original document because the idea lives on, and we can grasp its content without the original parchment. That was a significant development in human history and human civilization. And when we get to the American Revolution, really the story of the American Empire in general, the power of the ideas behind the story are incredibly significant. Honestly, they're even more important than I realized when I began looking into all of this. The idea of the cause that birthed American independence, that fueled the revolution, was enormously significant. We've seen this a little already in our story. It was the idea of spreading Christianity, even if it was a corrupt, violent, and gross version of Christianity that paved the way for Columbus in the Age of Discovery and the New World. It was the Reformation and the subsequent wars of religion in Europe that gave rise to the pursuit of religious freedom by the Pilgrims, by the Puritans, and what would become Massachusetts. It was the ideas of stock investments and capital that gave rise to the first settlers of Virginia. And when you boil it all down, the biggest answer to many of the questions about why, how, and when did the American Revolution take place at this point in the story, it always comes back to ideas. The Protestant Reformation that Martin Luther launched in 1517 gave rise to a surge of new considerations about and ideas about life, about God, about reality, freedom, truth, falseness. By the 18th century, there was yet another growing wave of new thoughts and philosophies that we call today the Enlightenment. Now, the American Revolution erupted at a moment when these Enlightenment ideas, long circulating in Europe, found uniquely fertile ground in the North American colonies. People were thinking differently. They were speaking differently. You can find it in the sermons being preached, the articles and essays being written, the letters being sent. The invisible world of ideas were changing. And we were at the precipice, human civilization was. They were at the precipice of a moment when these changes could not long be held behind the curtain of mere thoughts and considerations. Practical reality, the operations of life were about to change. And when the change begins, it really becomes unstoppable, flowing out not just in what would become known as America, but also into the wider world. By the mid-18th century, the British colonies had developed a political culture that blended Protestant moral independence, widespread literacy, and traditional local self-government. The nature and origins of the colonies meant that to a large extent, Britain and the rulers of Europe were largely hands-off in the New World, as settlements turned into cities and cities turned into a network of colonies stretching up and down the eastern seaboard of North America. Even as revolutions and politics kept Europe and various states of upheaval back on the mainland in the European continent, various states of upheaval and disarray for nearly 2 centuries, that followed the first settlements in North America. There was, behind all of that, a unique culture of independence and prosperity blossoming on these settlements in the colonies of North America. In the early 1700s, these organizations, known as the Committees of Correspondence, began to form. Now, these were local bodies of representatives here in North America, in the colonies, people who spoke on behalf of their constituents in Massachusetts, in Virginia, and elsewhere to help make the flow of information from England to the colonies and back more efficient. Now, there wasn't anything revolutionary about these groups. They were meant to aid their rulers back in England, not foment revolution. Remember these guys, okay? Because they're going to evolve. This Committee of Correspondence, it's going to evolve over the course of the next few decades. Into the discussions and debates and meetings of these Committees of Correspondence, the ideas of the Enlightenment began dropping and popping ever so often. Before long, and really without anyone giving too much attention to the facts of these changes, the philosophies of the Enlightenment were now fully arrived, and they were changing the way the colonists of America saw themselves and saw the world around them. By this point, the Enlightenment philosophy had fully arrived, and it didn't merely inspire elites and the wealthy, it ignited a broad cultural shift that helped ordinary colonists reinterpret their relationship to power, to authority, and to their own rights. Remember, we talked in the last episode about the Great Awakening and how that religious movement helped change a lot within American culture. It helped empower individuals. It weakened traditional institutions within the religious system. That was spreading beyond the church now and into the wider society. Operating right alongside that, there were these philosophical ideals of the Enlightenment. Questions were being asked that hadn't been asked before, and they were being answered, or the answers that were being given would have been unthinkable a couple of hundred years before. Now, no thinker shaped the American mind, the American perspective, more than this European guy by the name of John Locke. You might remember that name, okay? We talked about him in an earlier episode as he played a really large role in shaping the Charter of the Carolinas. Well, John Locke was an English philosopher who studied at Oxford in the 17th century. He saw the mind as a blank slate. That's where that thought comes from. A blank slate formatted by experience rather than pre-established design and inheritance. Right? His argument for natural rights, life, liberty, and property, his insistence that governments exist only through the consent of the governed, directly challenged monarchy and hereditary privilege. Locke rejected the divine right of kings and argued that people could overthrow governments that violated their rights. Now, I really enjoy the study of philosophy, especially philosophy that's translated into action and that changes the world. So one of my favorite books I read while researching this episode was by a professor, I think he's out of Clemson University. I could be wrong on that. His name is C. Bradley Thompson. The book is America's Revolutionary Mind. It's not that popular, to be honest, based on the reviews I read, but I found it fascinating as it does a line-by-line study of the Declaration of Independence and explores the origins of the ideas and philosophies behind that famous document. Thomas Jefferson once wrote that Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and John Locke represent the trinity of the 3 greatest men the world has ever produced. That was Jefferson's belief, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, mind you. If you try to read Locke's writing, John Locke's writings today, it's really pretty stale stuff, in my opinion. And that's largely because so much of what he taught and wrote is built into the cultural substructure of the American idea, the American perspective. We take it for granted today. But it was really revolutionary for the time. And it was these kinds of ideas that were seeping into the revolutionary mindset of the colonists in the land of America around the mid-century point before the Revolution. That author of the America's Revolutionary Mind, Thompson, he explains how, according to Locke, John Locke, individuals shouldn't be harmed of their life, liberty, and property. Now, that might sound familiar because it's almost quoted verbatim in the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote. Jefferson wrote, in the Declaration of Independence, he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." There's just a slight difference there, right? Locke said we're entitled to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson said we're entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a key right there, to understand the mindset of Americans on the edge of the American Revolution. For the philosopher John Locke and for the people like Jefferson, who highly admired his writings and thinking, property was tied to a person's identity. It was the entire sphere of rights that an individual possesses, their inherent nature of being human. Property included all natural rights, everything that belongs to a person, their life, their liberty, their labor, their free will, their pursuit of happiness. Government, according to the Americans who read Locke, existed only to secure an individual's property in this sense, and certainly not to take their property from them. It's really important to understand this as we get into the drive towards American independence, because the Americans at that time, they weren't simply upset about taxes. They were upset about what they understood as the English government's violation of their duty. When the Parliament of England taxed the Americans without giving the Americans a say in the matter, they were violating this duty as the Americans saw it. And not just violating, but they were treating them like slaves. Parliament was controlling the Americans' lives and beings without letting them have a voice in the matter. Thomas Jefferson, in the Declarations of Independence, he wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness because property was synonymous with the pursuit of happiness in his mind, as well as in the mind of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence. But just to be safe, just to make sure that Americans didn't mistakenly think this was a Declaration of Independence only for property owners of the elite, they opted for that phrasing instead. That's why Jefferson wrote it that way. It was specific, it was deliberate, and it was rooted to this rich philosophical idea. Now, of course, John Locke wasn't the only influential Enlightenment thinker that shaped the thoughts of the age during this unique era of history. The philosopher Montesquieu's theory of separation of powers offered a blueprint for preventing tyranny. His belief that political authority should be divided among branches of government resonated deeply with the colonists who feared centralized imperial control. His ideas later shaped the structure of the U.S. Constitution, but even before independence, they influenced colonial critiques of parliament's overreach. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his concept of the general will and the idea that legitimate authority arises from the people, helped colonists imagine a political order without monarchy. This idea could not have happened 100 years before. Not before 100 years before 1776, because it didn't fit into the heads of European colonists. Didn't fit into the heads of the Europeans. While Rousseau was more radical than many American thinkers of his time, or of that time, his emphasis on civic equality and collective self-rule reinforced the growing belief that the colonies could govern themselves. Then there was Voltaire. Voltaire's critiques of religious intolerance and authoritarianism supported the American push toward freedom of conscience. In a society already shaped by diverse Protestant sects, his ideas strengthened the argument that liberty required limits on both church and state. These were the great minds of the age. These and other Enlightenment ideas didn't spread evenly across the world. In Europe, entrenched aristocracies, powerful state churches, and rigid social hierarchies often blunted their impact. And that meant that many in the British Parliament simply couldn't fathom what was becoming a common sense reality in America. In the American colonies, several conditions made these ideas unusually potent. You had town meetings, colonial assemblies, and elected councils that had long accustomed Americans to participatory politics. Enlightenment theories didn't introduce self-government. They justified what colonists were already practicing in these committees of correspondence that we talked about earlier. Remember, England had been kind of hands-off on the colonies for a long time. There was all kinds of upheaval and drama going on in the European continent as the American colonies and settlements evolved. By the time the British Parliament, by the time King George III finally started to pay attention and take an active hand in matters within their American colonies, where they were shocked to learn it was just too late. These ideas had blossomed in the little patches of self-government up and down the eastern seaboard of America. And by the end of the French and Indian War, the Americans felt entitled to their own rights and liberties. Another element that helped in the spread of these ideas during this era were the pamphlets and newspapers and sermons that circulated widely. These were like the blogs and the social media of the day. One of the most significant of these pamphlets was Thomas Paine's Common Sense. We're going to look at Paine and Common Sense later in the series, but this little pamphlet was steeped in Enlightenment reasoning without the academic, usually Latin or Greek language. All right, it was in the normal but inspired language of the common man. That's what made it so powerful. Common Sense sold tens of thousands of copies, reached farmers and artisans and merchants all across the colonies. And Paine's attack on monarchy and hereditary rule made Enlightenment critiques accessible, made it emotionally compelling. And again, we also have to remember the Great Awakening that we've already talked about. It had already given a moral license for colonists to question traditional authority and trust personal conviction. Enlightenment rationalism blended surprisingly well with this spiritual independence, creating a culture primed to challenge political hierarchy. There was also the geographical separation that weakened imperial control and allowed Enlightenment ideas to flourish without immediate suppressions. Colonists could experiment intellectually and politically in ways the Europeans often couldn't. And so by the 1760s and the 1770s, British attempts to tighten imperial rule collided with a colonial society steeped now in Enlightenment thought. It became an imperial crisis for England before they even realized there was a crisis on their hands, and frankly, before the American colonists had even realized how far they had come in their thinking. When Parliament imposed taxes, restricted trade, asserted its supremacy, colonists in the Americas interpreted these actions not merely as policy disputes, but as violations of universal principles of liberty and natural rights. Enlightenment philosophy transformed political grievances into a moral revolution, and it did so in a uniquely American way. So let's pause right here, all right? I want to give space for the significance of the concept that ideas played in the shaping of American independence and revolution. I want to give that concept space in your minds to consider. In the next episode, we're going to look at the imperial crisis and the beginning of the march toward American independence and ultimately toward the American Revolution. That's coming up. All right, make sure you're subscribed to the feed so you can stay aware when these episodes drop. I'm J.B. Shreve, and you're listening to the End of History podcast, where we help believers make sense of the world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that built these times.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.